Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. In this video I'll be reviewing the third book of the trilogy on the Church in Canada. This one is called The Church in the Canadian Era by John Webster Grant. This book provides an excellent overview of Canadian church history from 1867 to 1967 and is easily accessible to students, teachers, and armchair historians alike. Grant does not explicitly state a thesis, but he does seem to argue that Canadian church history has been characterized by a tension between an impulse to preserve its religious heritage, often looking to Europe or the past for this, and an impulse toward innovation and contemporary relevance. Given the sheer social influence of the church, the first half-century of Confederation saw the measure of the church's success in shaping Canadian identity. Grant makes the important point that underlying the church's work in shaping Canada's identity, something that other historians have called nation building, was this presupposition of Christendom. Both Protestants and Catholics conceived of Canada as being a Christian nation in the broader context of Christendom and believed that Canada had a great destiny therein. The presupposition might seem obvious to some folks and overstated to others, but I have learned through my own research projects that this presupposition is not to be underestimated. In fact, the presupposition was a primary factor underlying nearly all of the church's engagement with social issues and reform, as well as their expansion, missions work, and response to wars. Another major theme that Grant identifies in Canadian church history, which he views as being premised on the presupposition of Christendom, is what he calls the motif of church union. Essentially, this was a trend that began in the mid-19th century in which the major Protestant denominations gradually initiated processes of organizational consolidation. The first examples of this would include things like the union of 4 Presbyterian denominations into a single Presbyterian Church in Canada in 1875, or the union of 6 Methodist denominations into one in the 1880s. This trend continued to persist, however, even at the interdenominational level. By the early 20th century, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists were in talks with the goal of uniting into one United Church of Canada, an event that took place in 1925. The trend continued even to the present day. In the 1950s through the 1970s, the United Church of Canada was in talks with Anglicans with a view to union. These talks eventually broke down and accomplished nothing. Small denominations continued to join the United Church of Canada even up to the present day. For Grant, the 3 themes of the presupposition of Christendom, the motif of church union, and a tension between past and present and future have characterized Canadian church history since Confederation, and I tend to agree with them. Grant's book is not without weaknesses, however. One weakness, much like the 2 preceding works in the trilogy, is that since it is primarily an overview and not a monograph, it tends towards generalizing and making claims that lack documented evidence. This is not to say no evidence exists for the claim, but merely that it is not documented in the endnotes. One of the strengths of Grant's work in this book, on the other hand, is that he provides excellent context, even if not always detailed enough, for developments in church history and the impact of external events. A more significant weakness in Grant's work is his tendency to use certain terms without clear definition and which also reveal a degree of his worldview. Some of the terms that he uses, in a mostly positive manner, include secularization, modernization, or the forces of modernization, and liberal evangelicalism. Now, the last of these terms is especially problematic because it is not a very well-known term. At least secularization and modernization are terms most people have heard, even if there are different definitions. But liberal evangelicalism is not common, and for those who are more familiar with Canadian church history, the term sounds somewhat contradictory. Grant uses the term in reference to the mainline Protestant denominations, which would include the United Church, Presbyterians, Anglicans, and sometimes Baptists. What exactly he means by the term remains unclear. Grant's categorization of Protestants becomes more convoluted with his use of conservative evangelicals, which for him seem to be on the opposite side of the spectrum from the liberal evangelicalism he favors. The conservative evangelicals he portrays in less flattering proportions, and he emphasizes their apparently anachronistic moralism and interest in saving souls as outdated ideals of 19th century evangelicalism. Liberal evangelicals he speaks of in a more positive light. This is likely due to his own position as a longtime member of the United Church in Canada. This also explains why he has a disproportionate number of examples from the United Church experience. And sometimes in the later chapters of the book, it seems as if he is describing the history of the United Church, and then incidentally mentions Anglicans, Presbyterians, and Baptists. So I'm just going to indulge myself in a brief tangent here. My suspicion is that he uses the term liberal evangelical to imply that the mainline Protestant denominations were the legitimate heirs and representatives of evangelicalism. Grant himself was from the United Church, as I mentioned, and the use of adjectives, conservative and liberal, to describe different types of evangelicals is an ongoing debate, the key questions of which are who represents evangelicalism and who has a right to represent evangelicalism. A lot of people who Grant would probably identify as conservative evangelicals would disagree with the idea that the mainline Protestant denominations of today are legitimate heirs or representatives of evangelicalism. A slight aside, but it seems to me that both conservative and liberal evangelicals, if either of these really exist, both assume that there is a fairly uniform evangelical tradition that they both lay claim to as their own. The fact is that there was no uniform evangelical tradition in Canada until the mid-19th century, and its uniformity was more of an illusion that everyone agreed to believe was real, while the reality suggested some diversity, although not a lot. It was not until the arrival of theological liberalism on Canada's shores that a divergence occurred, and even this was gradual. Theological liberalism was not offered a unified welcome by each of the major denominations, but it was quietly given a place to take root and grow in the churches, seminaries, and colleges. This was the main avenue of its growth in the mainline denominations. That some denominations were more conducive to its spread than others remains difficult to account for. The final thing I want to note about Grant is that he emphasizes the death of Christendom as being a somewhat delayed realization in Canada, compared to Europe and elsewhere, that hit most people in the 1960s, and more specifically many in 1965. This event, one which he sees as having been in the making outside of Canada for centuries and in Canada for at least half a century, entailed circumstances that were utterly foreign to the Canadian churches. The churches were left scrambling to orient themselves in relation to prevailing social norms and moral behaviors that were distinctly out of sync with the late Victorian Christianity the churches had been teaching right up until the 1960s. While he does provide a balanced discussion of this time and notes that not all was chaos or bad, he does emphasize a bit too strongly the end of the unofficial establishment of Christianity in Canada, as well as the declining interest in Christianity and new interest in other, often Eastern religions. Thus, the time after the 60s has been a time of searching and finding with varied success the new place for the churches in Canadian society. I've observed that since the shift in the church's place in Canadian society in the 1960s, there has been a sort of triumphalism trumpeted by some Christians and some historians, celebrating their belief that Christianity has been unshackled from the establishment and from the corridors of social and political power. Now, I disagree with this position because I think that while Christians should be glad that they are no longer part of this establishment, for many Christians, the concept that Canada is not a Christian country and the church has little to no authority in the public square leaves them without any moorings. This is because they were raised to believe in a Christian Canada. So celebrating the end of Christendom draws their ire and does little to help them adjust to the reality of what I'll call post-Christendom in Canada. Therefore, I do not think we should uncritically celebrate in such a way, but instead focus on teaching the Christians in North America that the Christian establishment of the 19th century and much of the 20th was not, as some would declare, a glory of Christendom to be returned to, but rather a situation that was probably at odds with Jesus' view of the church as well as the first 300 years of church history. Just because the church ended up in a position of authority in the late Roman Empire does not mean that should be normative for Christianity at all times in all places. It would be better for us to go on focusing on discipleship, living faithfully, pursuing justice, and sharing the good news, quietly but steadily, then drawing attention to ourselves and formulating shiny new theologies to reflect our new place on the so-called margins. Anyway, I apologize for not one but two tangents, the latter of which I guess was more of a rant, but that is probably a good indication that this book is thought-provoking. Grant provides a highly readable account of Canadian church history since 1967. It's not perfect, but rightfully it highlights some key themes. It less rightfully promotes his agenda and brings forward numerous questions about the current church in relation to when he wrote the book in the late 1980s. I definitely recommend not only Grant's book, but this whole trilogy that spans from the beginning of European presence in North America to the near present. So thanks for tuning in for this video, guys. Stay tuned for the next one that should be coming out in the next week or two. Thanks.